Welcome to another event at the Library Society, founded in 1748 and the second oldest circulating library in America. And this is all about beautiful books. And I can tell you, since I now am the proud owner of this beautiful book, Alice, that it is one of the most beautiful books I've ever seen. And looking at the string of her names, I was joking before you all joined us to say that there was an early member, either founding member or early significant board member of the Library Society with each one of those names throughout its history. And we've still got people now with those names, which is great. It really is an extraordinary story. And the people who are going to tell it today, thanks to Polly Buxton, are going to give you a wonderful evening. I want to encourage you to go and visit Buxton Books, which is on campus at the Library Society at 160 King Street, where Polly can make sure you get an autographed copy of this book that you will be able to show off to everybody. It is probably one of the smartest things I ever did, to bring an independent bookstore on campus. And we should all be supporting independent bookstores. They are what has kept most of us sane during the last year and will continue to enrich our lives. So I'm going to turn it over to Polly Buxton, who will introduce our wonderful speakers. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anne, and thank you all for coming tonight. What a wonderful crowd that we're seeing tuning in right now. I'm Polly Buxton at Buxton Books at 160 King Street. As Anne Cleveland so graciously said, I'm going to hold this up before I get started and let you see for yourself. If you don't have the book yet, this book is absolutely gorgeous. Alice Ravenel Huger Smith, Charleston Renaissance Artist. It is not only beautiful, but it is a beautifully told story, and you're in for a treat tonight. Whether you are very familiar with Alice Ravenel Huger Smith, or you are just tuning in because you're curious, you have a lot to learn. This is a wonderfully written book, and I am going to introduce the team of authors who put it together. The book was sponsored by, we'll ask a little bit more about this, but the Middleton Place Foundation, and published by Evening Post Books. So this is very much a Charleston story, this book in every way. And so thank you for being here tonight, Dwight, Anne, and Caroline. Dwight McInvaill directs the Georgetown County Library. His focus on innovation as a public librarian in South Carolina has been recognized by the New York Times and Carnegie Corporation. He was a member of the steering committee to found the Digital Public Library of America and served on the board of the Lowcountry Rice Culture Project. He has a master's degree in library science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and has given many lectures on Alice Smith, a mentor and friend to his parents. Anne Tinkler, Anne Gowd Tinker was hired, spent her professional career in international policy and programs, primarily focused on women's and children's health. A great niece of Alice Smith, Anne attended Vassar College and received graduate degrees from Georgetown and Johns Hopkins universities. She is a trustee of Middleton Place Foundation, on the board of the Gibbs Museum of Art, and a member of the Historic Charleston Foundation's National Advisory Council. Anne lives in Charleston with her husband, John. They divide their time between South Carolina and Massachusetts. And Caroline Palmer. Caroline is a communications, marketing, and human resources professional, a great niece of Alice Smith. She has a BA in art history from Duke University and an MBA from Columbia Business School. Caroline is a trustee of Middleton Place Foundation and lives with her husband, Kurt, and two daughters, Claire and Alice, in Charleston, South Carolina. I happen to know that she has an adorable dog that we might get to see, that sometimes comes to Buxton Books. And so, Dwight, I am going to turn this over to you and your team of authors, and we just can't wait to hear more about Alice.
Well, thank you so very much. I believe, Anne, you're going to lead off this evening. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, thanks so much, Polly and Anne. And Anne is actually right that we are definitely closely related to the Charleston Library Society, because our ancestor, a Middleton ancestor, was one of the founders, one of the 19 founders of the Society in 1748. We're very excited to share this launch as part of Women's History Month. There are lots of people to thank, including the Middleton Place Foundation, who were sponsors of the book, the Evening Post Books, our publisher, and many supporters, including Dr. and Mrs. Lewis Wright, for their generous support. Not only can we offer you a new book about Alice, but you can also see special exhibits in Charleston at both Middleton Place and the Evanston Alston House through January 10th of 2022. The Gibbs Museum of Art, where Alice was very active, is also opening special exhibitions at the end of April, and those will feature Japanese-inspired works by Alice and other members of the Renaissance. Dwight deserves the major credit for this book. He's been researching and writing about Alice for many years. Alice was a close friend of his parents in Alice's later years. I had shared stories about Alice with Dwight since he started this wonderful venture. But 2 years ago, he asked Caroline and myself to join him to take the book to publication. So we helped edit it. We helped provide some family perspective, particularly for the early years. And we are now joining him with celebrating its launch. In short, the book describes a prominent Charlestonian woman who immortalized the beauty and history of the Carolina Lowcountry and helped propel the region into a tourist destination to revive its economy. In her 60 years of career as a professional artist, she defied gender expectations and gained national acclaim. The book has 3 sections. The first is about Alice's early life. The second describes her years of, mid-years of the major works of art that she did and her involvement in the Renaissance. And thirdly, her last years when she knew the Mackenvilles and was very involved in public service. This evening, I'll talk about important influences on her life. Caroline will describe her artistic journey and most creative years, including the Renaissance era of the 1920s and 30s. Dwight will highlight how this book adds scholarly research and intimate insights to our knowledge of Alice, drawing on unpublished papers, letters, and interviews. If you think we have experienced a lot of change, imagine Alice's life trajectory. Born a decade after the Civil War, she lived through an incredible period of history. The collapse of the Southern economy, the terrible Jim Crow era, some of the worst fires and hurricanes in US history, the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, the Depression, and 2 world wars. She was descended from Arthur Middleton, who was the patriarch of Middleton Place and also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. She also has had French roots, as you can tell from the names Ravenel and Huger. The next slide shows her mother and her grandmother and father. And the grandmother, Alice's mother died when she was 12. So the main forces in her life were her grandmother, who was widowed at 27 with 6 children, and her father, both of whom had prospered from antebellum rice production. They viewed the past with nostalgia. Alice was particularly close to her father. He was active in Charleston's cultural life and served as curator and then vice president of the South Carolina Historic Society. Of her 4 siblings, she was closest to her older daughter, Caroline, who, like Alice, lived all her life at 69 Church Street. This is a portrait Alice did of her sister. And on the right is her older brother, Mason, in the center, who was my grandfather. He lived in New York, but visited often and helped finance the house at 69 Church Street. The 2 books that Alice co-authored were in collaboration with her father. She did 2 more books in her later life. These were her first 2. And her detailed architectural drawings inspired the historic preservation movement in Charleston and the genesis of the Society for the Preservation of Old Dwellings, which is now known as the Preservation Society. Charleston was actually the first city in the country to establish an historic district with regulatory control. Her later book on the Carolina rice plantation of the 1850s was also influenced by her father's romanticized stories of his plantation days as a child, as well as Alice's firsthand experience and study of the final days of rice planting in the early 1900s. Alice and her sister, Caroline, as I mentioned, lived their entire life at Church Street. This is a drawing of the house before the current owners removed the piazza. When Alice was a child, the house was full with 16 family members living together. It's actually now for sale from the current owners. I was fortunate enough to know my great Aunt Alice when I was a child. Both my parents had roots in Charleston, so for 2 weeks, every spring, we came down from the north to see our relatives. We stayed at 69 Church Street, where Alice and her sister Caroline welcomed us. This is a picture before I show this slide. Let's go back to the other one. This is a picture of how dilapidated Charleston was in 1906. This is the picture of Church Street. And you can see the horse and carriage, and most of Charleston was really a dilapidated mess in the early 1900s. So back to Caroline and Alice. We stayed with them every spring for 2 weeks when we would come down from the north to visit our relatives, and always went out to Middleton Place together. I remember Alice telling a story about how one day when she was 16, she walked 15 miles to Middleton Place and 15 miles back to Church Street with her father. She spent much of her early years exploring the woodlands, swamps, and birds of the Lowcountry. Middleton Place was one of her favorite destinations because she was a Middleton descendant and she had cousins living there. Here on you can see Alice's painting of her cousin Josephine Smith standing against a live oak tree. And you can see how the massive tree contrasts with the fragility and grace of the girl and the peacock. The next painting is one of butterfly lakes at Middleton Place, which are between the terraced lawn and the Ashley River in the background. Besides Middleton Place, I remember fun occasions with Aunt Alice and other relatives spent on a parcel of woodsy land that my grandfather, her brother Mason, owned on the Wando River. This is one of my favorite paintings she did of the place we called Riverbend. On the right, there are two of several wood panels made of mahogany with oil paint. She painted these to hang on the wall of the small cabin on the Wando property. The mahogany panels and this last slide help show the variety and breadth of Alice's creative style. This is one of a series of 3 watercolors showing a cluster of racing dinghies, which she painted while visiting my family in Massachusetts. You can see the breeze on the shimmering water and bright colored sails with a brilliance and clarity that's very different from her more nuanced pictures of the Lowcountry. She composed a delightful poem to go with this series of this race and wrote other noteworthy poems later in her life. I will now introduce my daughter Caroline to tell you about Alice's artistic journey.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Palmer. Thank you for being part of this Zoom tonight. I've always been in awe of my great-great Aunt Alice, and working on this book has helped me learn so much more about her. When Alice was young, she attended Miss Sass's School for Girls, which was located at 23 Legree Street and shown in the drawing on the left. In the afternoons, when she was about 12 to about age 19, she also took art classes at the Carolina Art Association, which later became the Gibbs Museum of Art. She studied under a French art teacher named Lucy Louise Ferry, who taught her the fundamentals of drawing and painting and introduced her to the French Impressionists and the Barbizon School. Ferry had studied in Paris. She'd won numerous academic awards in France and in Europe, and her work had been featured in 3 Paris exhibitions. So not only did she serve as a role model of a woman succeeding in the professional art world, but she also trained Alice in the basic building blocks of art from a French academic perspective. This photo of her class on the right shows Alice with a raised paintbrush in her hand, and Lucy Louise Ferry is on the far right. Alice's training at the Carolina Art Association gave her a strong foundation that allowed her to produce precise depictions and architectural drawings for some of the books that she developed, such as this drawing of 54 Hazel Street, which was for the Dwelling Houses of Charleston book. Her strong training in drawing fundamentals also enhanced her paintings because it allowed her to create beautifully rendered foregrounds over more fluid backgrounds in watercolor. By the time Alice turned 20 in 1896, she had begun her professional art career. Later in her memoirs, she wrote, "In those first days of painting, I found it hard to sell work enough to pay for my materials. And I did everything from place cards and handkerchief cases and painted fans to little street scenes, anything." An example of one of those street scenes, which she sold for $1, can be seen on the left. And after several years of this kind of work, Alice had an opportunity to broaden her skill set. It was in 1902, and she spent the summer in New York City with her sister, Caroline, who went to study piano there. And because of the family's relatively limited resources, Alice didn't ever have the benefit of a formal education in a major art center. So it must have been pretty exciting for her when she had the opportunity to spend a few months in New York. And while she was there, she took lessons in miniature portrait painting with an artist named Cecile Payne. And miniature portraits, one of which you can see in the center here, were typically painted in watercolor on a small disc of ivory. And they were small enough to fit in the palm of the hand. And they were typically they served as personal mementos in a time before the age of photography. So this miniature here is one that Alice produced while she was learning from Cecile Payne. And when she came home from New York, that training really paid off because she was able to produce and sell miniature portraits as well as full-sized portraits. And you can see two of her full-size portraits here. One is a beautiful self-portrait that she did in 1908. And then on the right is a portrait she did of her father. And one of the remarkable things is that they look like they're done in oil on mahogany, but they're actually watercolor. Another way Alice learned and broadened her skill set was the way she took advantage of learning from all of the artists who traveled through Charleston. And one of those people was a man named Burge Harrison. He mentored Alice starting in 1908 and for the next 2 decades. He was part of an artistic style called tonalism, which was a style of art that emerged in the 1880s when American artists began to paint landscapes with an overall tone of colored atmosphere or mist. The work on the left here is a pastel drawing, which was done by Harrison of Charleston Harbor. You can see the atmospheric technique and limited muted palette. Tonalist painters really emphasized mood and shadow, and Alice clearly absorbed that because her art became, as a result, more subjective, more abstract, and more evocative. So one example on the right is her painting, Clearing the Woods at Dean Hall Plantation. And you can see that her method of watercolor painting was thoroughly wet on the right side of the painting, which suggests the burning debris along with the billowing of heavy smoke amongst the trees. Another big influence on Alice was her distant cousin, Maud Alston Reed, who she referred to as Alston. And around 1909, he moved to Charleston and became really a significant influence in her life for the next 11 years. In fact, Alice fell in love with him, and they probably would have gotten married if he hadn't been so sick with rheumatoid arthritis. He introduced her to his vast collection of Asian texts and Japanese woodblock prints, which proved to be a huge influence on her style throughout her life. She learned through him about Chinese landscape philosophies and Japanese methods and aesthetics. And throughout her career, her strongest work really does reveal those influences. On this slide, you can see a striking similarity between Hiroshige's woodblock print and a painting by Alice on the right, which usually hangs in my home, which is called Peacock on a Live Oak Bough at Middleton Place. With Alston's encouragement, Alice also experimented with woodblock printing herself. She created several beautiful prints, such as the two you can see here, Moonflower and Hawk Moth, and Moonlight on the Cooper River. Without a doubt, studying Japanese prints with Alston, as well as the hands-on experience of cutting and inking her own woodblock prints, had a profound effect on Alice. She began to use different compositional methods, sometimes using a vertical format, sometimes employing the concepts of negative space and asymmetrical design. And a reverence for nature really shines through in so much of her work. Recently, a collection of 4 notebooks was discovered that Alice had created for Maud Alston Reed. It's a calendar for November 1917, and it's inscribed to Maud Alston Reed on the first page. The influence of Japanese prints is so clear, and the fact that Alice created such a unique gift speaks to their special relationship. Sadly, Alston died in 1920, and after his death, Alice took a brief hiatus from painting. But in the early 1920s, she returned to art with greater inspiration and skill than ever before. At this point, Alice was in her mid-40s. She was entering a more mature artistic phase, and she wrote in her memoirs that it was her father who guided her back from woodblock prints to watercolors. She established a studio at 8 Atlantic Street in downtown Charleston, which she used for almost 20 years. And Garden Gate with Wisteria, the painting on the left, shows that studio. The 1920s and 30s were important years for Alice and for Charleston. She was at the center of a movement in the 20s and 30s called the Charleston Renaissance that brought national attention to the region and helped nurture its economic recovery. This cultural reawakening of the city between the world wars happened when artists, writers, and community leaders came together. They saved historic buildings from destruction, they promoted tourism, and they shared the character and the natural beauty of the area. Other well-known artists of the time included Elizabeth O'Neill Verner, Anna Hayward Taylor, and Alfred Huddy. During this time, when most Charleston society ladies played more traditional roles, Alice was a professional artist, a preservationist, an historian, a published author and illustrator, and a teacher and role model. Her work was featured in at least 45 exhibitions in over 30 cities nationwide during the 1920s alone, as well as in Paris and Florence. Many of her most celebrated works depict the rice fields, marshes, and cypress swamps of the Lowcountry. She was talented in so many artistic mediums, as you can see, but she was masterful with watercolor in particular. Her luminescent landscapes evoke nature's spiritual power and beauty. And in so many of her paintings, you can see the influence of tonalism and Japanese aesthetics on her unique style. I'll hand over to Dwight now.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm Dwight McInvaill, a friend and a beneficiary of Alice Ravenel Huger Smith. At World War II's onset, with the Naval Yard's expansion, Charleston became known as a federal congested production area. Many families south abroad opened their homes to servicemen who needed lodging. Alice and her sister Caroline at 69 Church Street filled their upstairs drawing room with cots. As we can see in this next slide, in 1943, my father, U.S. Navy Ensign Harry Clemson Mackenville Jr., was invited to dinner. He read his poetry upon request. Soon the sisters moved him in. He married my mom, Tallulah. When he went to war in the Pacific, Alice housed her and gave her watercolor lessons, both verbally and in writing, while also writing to him. Diaries were also kept, with photo albums, future archival materials piled up. Post-war, Alice mentored my folks further when the couple bought the Pink House on Chalmers Street and opened it as an art gallery. Alice fulfilled a promise to my dad, Harry. She returned to painting watercolors after the war. She wrote her reminiscences, which she dedicated to him. Mackenville children arrived, as you can see by the photo on the right, and Alice and her sister Caroline became like grandmothers to us. When Harry became afflicted by a chronic illness towards the end of Alice's life, she left all 4 Mackenville children, including me, the money to attend college. Next slide, please. Alice gave my father, Harry, her sketchbook #1 from Wapula Plantation, the Hayward home on the Cooper River in Berkeley County, where she had studied its landscape and its rural life closely from about 1915 to 1925 to harvest ideas for future paintings. She aimed to document the last days of rice planting. Next slide. She loved to depict views of fields and workers, and as she later noted, I turned my attention to knowing and learning what lay around me, trees, birds, crops, grass. I studied it all. I have piles of sketchbooks with studies, the little cabins, the cotton and rice, anything that happened along. So I do know my own country. As we can see in the next slide, In the front of one sketchbook, she wrote, "I think I must be a throwback to a pioneer forefather. I feel at home sitting in a wet and muddy boat, scrambling up on the banks and hummocks to lighten the boat, soaking wet with dew, and then scorching in the sun, looking at the raised head of an alligator swimming and carrying his tail above the water, or at a deer peeping through the grasses and the palmettos, and many, many small birds, busy, gay, and lovely to behold." As we can see by the next slide, she also took a lot of photographs and carefully noted names on the back of them. Henry Mayers, for instance, helped her to see around 1910 how one balanced a work basket on one's head. Rhea Wetters posed for Alice as well. As indicated by the next slide, Alice used such sketches and photos as a basis for many works. Here's an example of a snapshot called Anna and Mathilde that she transformed into a sketch for the book, A Woman Rice Planter, in 1913. Later, in her preparation for the book, A Carolina Rice Plantation in the 50s, which was the 1850s, at least a third of its illustrations have some basis in Alice's photographs. As we can see in the next slide, in addition to Middleton Place and to Wapula Plantation, she also loved the Great Blake Reserve, a 1,040-acre natural area with a 200-year freshwater cypress lake and swamp, featuring North America's oldest known bird nesting area. It is now more commonly known as the Washoe Reserve. She wrote that the water itself bore water lilies, lotus, and countless little white or yellow blooming water plants. At times, the water would be covered with a silken carpet of pinkish gray or golden green algae, which made a soft sound as a boat moved through it and closed up slowly over the ebony trails of water left by the boat. Another algae covers the water with a veil of Tyrian purple. During her artistic peak from the mid-1920s to the mid-1930s, she painted the watercolor Lotus in the Great Blake Reserve, which she gave to my folks as a wedding present in 1944. It serves as a cover for our new book, Alice. As we can see in the next slide, in many of her watercolors, Alice directs one's eye intentionally to sections of a work painted in a drier, more precise manner, while subordinating other areas by rendering them in wetter and vaguer ways. As the next slide shows, from a drier focal point, she often guides one's sight by the means of anticipated movements, like the flight of a bird, or through lines like this wavy one of lotuses that seem to dance sinuously and gracefully. But as the next slide showed, she also sometimes used the spot and dash method, or the interplay of strokes of complementary colors like this beautiful gold and purple, or of light and dark effects to suggest the vibration of light across a painting in ways put forth to her earlier by the tonalist Burge Harrison. As the next slide indicates, not content during her youth or maturity to look upon nature from a safe distance, like many women of her era, she instead ventured forth fearlessly into the wild because she felt that good art must have roots. She found wading through the swamps to be an especially invigorating and rewarding experience. But as the next slide shows, dangers did exist. She learned from hunters with whom she sometimes roamed how to deal with snake bites, and alligators did swim beneath the dark pools and rivers, as seen here in the corner of Lotus and the Great Blake Reserve. As the next slide indicates, Lotus and the Great Blake Reserve had for years a place of prominence in the large second floor drawing room of Alice and Caroline's home at 69 Church Street, as shown, as we can see in the picture on the right, on the wall behind Caroline's grand piano during a small school group visit in 1944. As the next slide shows, in 1956, Alice painted her last work, Final Flight. By her, the heron was often used as a symbol for the artist. She then decided to lay her brushes her watercolor brushes aside. For as she put it, she felt that her hands would no longer obey the dictates of her own mind. She nevertheless continued to be engaged artistically, civically, and culturally until her passing in 1958. She left behind much brightness and happiness for all of us. We sincerely appreciate your interest in Alice Smith. To learn more about her, please visit the current combined exhibit at Middleton Place and the Edmonston Alston House, along with upcoming ones at the Gibbs Museum of Art and also the Florence County Museum. And we sincerely hope that we have enticed you through this brief sampling of images and stories to buy our new coffee table hardback, Alice, published by Evening Post Books in tandem with the Middleton Place Foundation. All net sales will benefit Middleton Place. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dwight. That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Anne and Caroline and Dwight. You did give us a taste, a sampling of this book. I will tell you all, I haven't put this book down since it arrived at Buxton Books. It's incredible. You can see from some of the images that they've shown with you tonight and just a little taste of the story that this is a book for art historians and for artists. It is a human story. It's a Charleston story, and it's really beautifully told. And the images, I keep going back to some of you chose some really magical ones to share, and they are here in this book. So I do hope we have signed copies here at Buxton Books. So that's my little shameless plug before I asked Dwight to tell me, and Anne and Caroline to tell me a little bit more. There's a link, and I believe that Dutch has put that in there so you can purchase without leaving home. And you can also give us a call. Wait until after the chat because we're not going to answer the phones during the talk, but we ship and we deliver, and we would love to see you at Buxton Books. So please do buy the book wherever you buy it. You will not be sorry. I'm giving it as a gift to as many people as I can afford to get it to because it's absolutely extraordinary. But Dwight, will you tell us a little bit about how this developed, how the book developed? You told us a little bit about your connection, but tell us the story of how this book came to life.
Well, Polly, it'd be a real pleasure. For me, writing this book has been a passion for decades, and the current results are based substantially on the special archives and artwork and memories that two intertwined families have shared with one another and are sharing with you. And from my earliest years onwards, Alice was a significant feature of my life. First, as a living person, taking walks on the beach and learning about horses and carriages, that I really remember. And but then later as a memory, because I only knew her, can remember knowing her for about a year. And she gave us over 20 watercolors. And so for me, it was like growing up in an art gallery of her works and seeing things that had special remembrances for our family, because many of the images were symbolic of things that we had gone through. And then later in my 20s, my dad passed away early, and my mother said, Dwight, go to a cabin in the woods. I think you'll be interested in some things there that you find. So I went to my grandparents' a place in Conway, and there I found a trove of over 400 letters by her, carefully packed in a cedar trunk. And I don't want you to think this was out in the wilderness. It was right beside my grandparents' house, all right? the manuscripts were not in danger. But my mom put me in touch with the Smith family, and so I made an appeal to write a book. And they said, Dwight, we love your enthusiasm, but you're a bit too young. And they were right. And then life intervened, and the decades passed, and then I came back to it about 10 years ago, and I went to knock on the door of Anne and her cousin Mady in the Boston area, and they said, yes, let's do it. And so we began, and manuscripts went back and forth, and then Anne had the wisdom to say, Caroline, I have a special project that I think you'd be interested in. And oh my, we had a project team And so it was just wonderful. And we got together and went through all of these wonderful materials and memories, and we discovered things together, and we found perfectly wonderful images and things that have never been shared before. You all have a great deal of excitement to look forward to. And then I must admit, must mention Martha Severin. She wrote the book about 25 years ago on Alice, and she is a giant in the field of artistic scholarship. And we all three are trying to balance on her shoulders. It's not easy, but she's mentored graciously our activities and again, helped us to produce an extraordinary story.
Well, you absolutely achieved that. And I believe that this adds to that story in a way that you overachieved in that. And you actually answered my question about bringing Anne and Caroline in. It's made so much stronger through the collaboration. And it's clear that so much was put into editing and choosing and weaving the story into something that's quite extraordinary. I envision you, I love the image of you knocking on Anne's door. Anne, would you tell us a little bit about what you thought when he first knocked on your door and asked?
I was rather intimidated. That was a big commitment that we were making to work on this book, because there was a lot of wonderful material that Dwight had pulled together, and we had some stories, and it was really a joy for me to collaborate on a daily basis with my daughter, but also to get to know Dwight better, and really we've sort of become like a family. And what I learned about Alice was that she wasn't just my great aunt who read to me on the joggling board and took me for picnics, but that she really was a multifaceted and accomplished artist who, and I've learned a great deal, not only about her, but also about her era and the Lowcountry while working on the book.
Yeah, I can only imagine, because her accomplishments would be something extraordinary in today's time, but to have done this when she did it and is really quite amazing. And Caroline, what was it like for you to be brought into this? What was it like to be a part of this team honoring Alice?
Oh, it was great. I've always admired my Aunt Alice's paintings. Just they hung in our home growing up, and I actually really aspired to be an artist because of her, and I still draw and paint in my spare time. In fact, I recently took a watercolor painting class, and boy, is it hard. I mean, the fact that she was able to master watercolor is incredible. But being able to work on the publication of this book has been fantastic, because when I moved from New York to Charleston about 3 years ago, I had left my corporate job. And so this project came at just the right time. I was able to use some of my skills from the business world, but apply them to a really meaningful project. And also, get in touch with the history of Charleston and the history of my family in a way that I had never before. And being able to get to know Dwight better, being able to work with your mom is an awesome thing to be able to say you can do. And I think we're really proud of the way this book turned out. So it's been a very fun project. I should also mention that my youngest daughter is named Alice because of Aunt Alice. So she's her namesake.
Oh, that's a good namesake to have. Before I was going to go back to your mom with something, but tell me a little bit about how you feel, what you discovered about gender, and how gender played a role in Alice's life, and what you discovered about that as a young woman living today and looking back with a contemporary lens.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's fantastic that she was such an influential woman in a period that was really I mean, it was a conservative, male-dominated world at the time. And so, you know, Southern ladies typically played much more traditional roles, but here she was garnering so much respect for herself, both, you know, in the activities in the community and with her art. And that's really astounding. I was also really proud to learn that she was a founding member of organizations that supported artists, including women artists, like the Etchers Club and the Southern States Art League. And she mentored and guided other women artists. So that makes me proud. And I also think it's pretty amazing how pioneering she was in that way.
Yeah, she absolutely was. And maybe this is a question more for Anne, for your mom. But when you went back to this concept of looking at Alice through a contemporary lens, the Charleston Renaissance period has been looked at with a bit more of a critical eye. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering, maybe each of you have something to say about this, but Anne, from your presentation, I think perhaps if you would comment on how you feel when Alice's work and life is looked at through a more contemporary and often critical lens.
Right. No, that's an important question. And you know, there has been an evolution in the way the Charleston Renaissance has been viewed. It's been criticized for its elitist, Eurocentric perspective and a romanticized view of Charleston. And that shaped Charleston's identity as a tourist destination and nurtured a selective historical memory that we all have inherited. In working on the book, we had many discussions about how to portray this historic figure who was born into a prominent family of rice planters, held nostalgic views of history, and lived in the segregated South. We've had thought-provoking conversations about the Charleston Renaissance in light of today's efforts to tell a more inclusive story of the past. We benefited enormously from learning how others have interpreted Alice's work over the years. And Jonathan Green, who's one of our reviewers and a fellow Middleton Place Foundation trustee, describes her rice plantation series as a unique record of the process of rice plantation production that reflects dignity, ingenuity, and skills that were brought by the West Africans. Others have underscored that the series romanticizes this plantation life and neglects the abhorrent and cruel conditions under which the enslaved African Americans lived and worked. Alice, like other Renaissance artists, painted the beauty she saw in nature rather than the ugliness and injustice, which also existed and is certainly a part of the full story that needs to be told about the past. An example in the book is we describe the experience of Edwin Charleston. Charleston was a talented African-American artist at the Renaissance period of time. There was no mention of him in the tourist books. He was denied many opportunities by white Charlestonians. Now, however, if you go to the Gibbs, you will see his works alongside with the other Renaissance artists. More artists are becoming recognized for their skills and creativity, and more diverse voices are being heard, both to tell a more complete story about the past, as well as to shape a more diversified cultural identity of today.
Oh, that's really beautifully said. And anyway, I do think that it's addressed really interesting and powerfully the way in this book, and also the Middleton Place Foundation, where you're a trustee, that they've done an extraordinary job of telling the whole story and making that a real focal point and mission, as well as I know the Gibbs as well has done this. And so it's, you know, I'm editorializing here, but just to inject that these ideas can be held in tension, and we can simultaneously tell this whole story and do it. I just think Jonathan Green, his review was beautifully said and powerfully needed right now. So thank you for doing that. And for talking about that. And I also loved that when we were preparing for this talk and we had a few pre-conversations off screen, that when I asked what Dwight and Caroline and Anne, was anything off limits to talk about, because we want to feel conversational and open, but that we didn't want to take you by surprise. And you all three just said immediately and powerfully, absolutely not. Yes, you know, this embracing of the whole story is very powerful and important. And so thank you. Thank you for your attitude with which you approached this very sacred subject. So thank you. So I'm going to go back to Dwight and ask him, Dwight, what surprised you the most in the process of writing this book? And perhaps what did you discover both about Alice, but even maybe about yourself that you might share with us today?
Well, because I work in the field of library science and have kind of advanced in it across the years, I had more and more occasions to travel to work on committees. And the Digital Public Library of America, when I worked on that steering committee to create that entity, I was able to travel from the West Coast to the East Coast, north to south, which I couldn't do. Well, let's face it, librarians don't make a whole lot of jack, huh? And so in any case—
booksellers don't either.
That's right. Every librarian that's on here tonight deserves a raise. But in any case, was able to go across the country and go to different research centers and do some investigating, like in Tulane in New Orleans, on Mount Austin Reed, and also to go to Boston to do the same because he studied there, and then go to the West Coast to do work on Helen Hyde, one of her teachers, you know, just hither and thither. San Francisco, again, more on Helen Hyde. And, but when I came back home to Charleston, I live up in Pauley, so I do consider Charleston the suburb of but in any case, when I came down to the suburb of Charleston, I went to the Gibbs, and I was, you know, I asked Sarah Arnold at the Gibbs, the curator there, if I could see the archives that they had there. And she brings out a sheaf of photographs and opens it up, and lo and behold, you know, I just read on a plane A Woman Rice Planter, and I looked at the photographs, and I looked at her, and I looked at the photographs, and I said, these are the source materials for A Woman Rice Planter. And then I realized also, these are the source materials for a Carolina rice plantation of the 50s. And then I went on to the Digital Public Library of America, and I found images, and in the metadata it said that a planter had taken photographs for Miss Alice to use. You have photographs on which she has written the name Rhea Wetters, Henry Mayers, and others. So we know who the people in the works are. And the one of Rhea Wetters, where she's holding that staff, you know, well, actually, you see the picture in the book where she's holding a staff, and then Alice transforms it into a scythe, which is the exact image that one of the Barbizon painters did, Deschamps Dalouette. I can't remember the Barbizon artist right now, but he did that painting, and you can just see the echo of the Barbizon art coming through, and remember that her teacher was French. And it's just like, whoo, you know, it expands, and you begin asking questions, and you begin thinking and figuring things out, and the puzzles, just the pieces just begin to come together. That's exciting. And that changed.
That is pretty exciting. And I know, anyway, we could continue. I have so many favorite images in here that I want to ask you all about. But the book really does a beautiful job of identifying them. And you did that research for us so that we get to just read the story. And and revisit it over and over again. I'm going to go to Dutch because Dutch has a couple of questions, and I know we want to get everyone, try to keep this as close to an hour as we can, but Dutch at the Library Society has some wonderful, has a few things I know that he wants to ask you about personally. So I am going to do one final plea to ask you to please buy a book. That's how bookstores and right there you go, that's the book, and Middleton Place Foundation and Evening Post Books and the Charleston Library Society. We just appreciate you being here all tonight, and thank you so much. Thank you, Dwight. Thank you, Caroline and Anne. And I think Dutch has a few questions from the audience.
Yeah, I do. So this one question, I think it sums up our conversation really nicely, is the evolution of Alice's artistic skills is interesting, obviously. But based on each of your individual researches of her life and the art, what do you think the message, what do you believe she'd want the message to be relayed today? What do you think she would want us to get out of her work?
Her work is infused with love.
I think what she really wanted was she had a passion for nature. Mm-hmm. And I think what she wanted was to really celebrate the beauty and naturalness of the Lowcountry. She also was a business person and wanted to help Charleston recover from the economic collapse. And therefore, part of her effort was to bring tourists to Charleston, to raise national awareness of the area. And the best way to do that was to show the birds and the flora and fauna and the marshes and everything else that makes the Lowcountry so special. She started out with portraits because that's what she could make money on initially. But really what she'd love to do was to paint the Lowcountry, the beauty of the Lowcountry.
And I would add to that to say, I think her passion for the beauty and the uniqueness of the area would lend her to probably send a message of conservation, how to conserve what we all love and know and enjoy, and balance that with economic progress. And that's really what they were doing in the Charleston Renaissance, was, bringing economic vitality back to the region, but not at the expense of the beauty and the landscape.
Yeah.
She enjoyed meeting people and connecting with people, and people were the most important thing.
So we did have a question come in earlier today, actually. We had a member who is a Charleston Ravenel, and they wanted to know exactly how so are they related to Alice, and what is that connection there? Would you be able to help answer that question?
Well, I believe
we have a lot of Huguenot ancestors. I mean, that's really Charleston. It was the British who came over for economic profit, and the Huguenots who fled from France and the kind of prejudice that was being associated with being a Huguenot in France at that time. And I actually went with my cousin Chivas Leland to France to explore our Huguenot roots just 2 years ago. And we went to the house of Daniel Ravenel in Vitré, France, which he owned and had been owned by his family since the 1700s. So the Ravenels came from their Vitry to the west coast of France, and actually went to England before they came to Charleston. Most of the Huguenots had that experience of going first to England, so that they were more attuned to the British way of doing things and the language and so forth. So they did assimilate fairly well into the culture. But yes, Ravenels and Hugies, and then also the Rutledges and the Middletons. I mean, all of these names we are very familiar with, and lots of us are are cousins. I mean, my parents, believe it or not, were both descended from Middletons. They were seventh cousins. And, you know, how many people know their seventh cousin? But that's Charleston, I guess.
Well, I have a real, I guess it's not super personal, but it's a question for each of you. And I think it would be a perfect way to wrap up. But so it's so interesting getting to see kind of the diversity of her mediums. I'll make it a little bit harder. I'll say, if you took watercolor out of it, what would be your favorite medium or type of work that Alice produced throughout her careers?
Caroline, what do you think?
Well, this is a little different, but I would maybe say the illustrations she did for a children's book that never got published until recently. But it was a story about protecting birds' nesting island. So it was part of that sort of conservation message. And she illustrated it with these beautiful herons and island and sort of marsh and river scenes. And it's beautiful. So I would say some of the illustrations she did and that weren't really well known when she was alive.
I think another thing that was really interesting for us to learn was that, yes, she did take photographs, she did do sketches, but she also recorded in excruciating detail every color that she, because of course there was no color photography, it was all black and white. Mm-hmm. And so along with these sketches and photographs, she would have very detailed information about the shades of the colors and the, you know, the sunlight and so forth, the shadows. And it's really quite wonderful to be able to see the process that she used of starting with a beautiful scene and then kind of putting it all together with all those elements that she had. And she was also a poet. I mean, I loved some of the poetry that she wrote that is not very well known, but it was really quite delightful.
Wonderful. Good. What about you?
I love her wood blocks, and I think the story of her romance with Charleston Reed it just resonates in so many different ways.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank all three of you. I want to thank Polly. I want to thank everyone who's in the our room right now, who's gotten to experience this lecture and presentation tonight. This has been really special, and the connections that we here at the Charleston Library Society have to Alice and to our current members today. It's great to be able to look back at Charleston history and bring it into that contemporary lens and have these conversations and get to learn something new. So I just want to thank all three of you again. Buy your copy from Buxton Books, obviously. If not, still buy a copy. But everyone else, just have a wonderful evening. Thank you again, and we'll see you soon.
Good
Thank
night.
you all.
Have a great night, guys.
Good night, all.